Hello, welcome to our third lecture of the program Audit on Fingertips, where we are talking about the good practices of the audit approaches to the main audit phases like planning, fieldwork, and reporting. Today we are going to talk about the fieldwork and the special operating effectiveness testing. We will review such approaches as attribute testing, observation, and reperformance. We'll also talk about the way of defining the populations and making samples out of those populations. So let's start. So operating effectiveness testing. Why do we need it and why it is important? On two previous lectures, we discussed how to assess design of the controls, meaning how the logic behind the control function or control capability in application works. Does it make any sense? Does the plan to mitigate the risk would work? Or probably the idea behind the control is not sufficient to mitigate the risk. Maybe it has some deficiencies, some flaws, and it doesn't make any sense to proceed to verification. How the control works. Well, let's assume that the planning phase was completed successfully. We found all the evidence proving that the controls are designed well, and now we need to check how those controls, how their design was implemented in living environment. Alright, so there are three main approaches to operating effectiveness testing. First is attribute testing, then observation, and reperformance. We will go one by one and check how each of them helps to demonstrate control effectiveness, or maybe may unearth some flaws. So attribute testing. Attribute testing, actually it's a procedure which starts from the control design, then moves to identification of failure scenarios. Once we define the failure scenarios, we put together a testing program to run, and then we execute this testing program. That's just 4 steps, very easy, very straightforward. So what are the advantages of attribute testing comparing to other audit procedures? First of all, it's very effective because we just take direct evidence and we review and analyze those direct evidence. We get the direct outcome. Second, we can check the past periods because the only thing we need for the attribute testing are the artifacts for the period we plan to review. So for instance, if we review last 12 months, we expect the artifacts to be in place. We do not depend on the control team performance or availability. We only need to work with the evidence. And, which is very important, especially in modern world, it's very good for automation. It's very good for the AI use cases. So we have a lot of space here to enhance efficiency of our audit function through CATs, computer-assisted tools and techniques. Right, so let's move on. So first, control design. So what's the phase? So we need to get back to the information we collected during the planning and check how actually control is implemented. So in this particular case, we will review the example where we run the transaction workflows, and makers who create transaction in line with customer orders, customer documentation, contracts, payment instructions, buy-sell requests, etc., create those payment documents, and checkers review those transactions, verify their details, and decide if the transaction should be approved for further processing or probably rejected and sent back to makers for additional work to be done. Keep having this in mind, the control design, we need to think about what are the scenarios where control may fail. What are particular process branches where control may not work as expected. So, for instance, we may assume that there could be the case, could be a scenario where when makers may approve their own payments. So they create a transaction and they approve this transaction. Therefore, we do not follow the principle of separation of duties. Or checkers may not review the transactions diligently. Or probably, well, we expect everyone to be professional, but maybe sometimes number of transactions is too large, and checkers don't have enough time to meet the deadlines and perform diligent reviews all the time. They may just start making errors. And we may have another scenario where makers do not fix identified errors, and they run the transaction again, and it's being sent to the processing without all the errors identified by the checkers not addressed. There could be more scenarios, but let's focus on those three just as an example. The importance of this is a very important step in OET, operating effectiveness testing. Why? Because the exhaustiveness of this list will define the effectiveness of the whole operating effectiveness testing. So when you're looking through this list of scenarios, keep in mind that it depends on the process, it depends on the systems, right? If you have different scenarios which are independent, you probably need different populations to be created, but more about that a bit later. Okay, right, so next step, after we identify the scenarios, we are putting together a test program to identify whether those, so how to test those scenarios. And the test steps may not only be about the scenarios, but probably also about the completeness of the artifacts. So here you see an example of the test program. So first step is about availability of the evidence. Of course, during the planning phase of the audit, when we assessed the design, we checked the artifacts, right? But we checked the artifacts in terms of that the control is expected to create artifacts of sufficient quality containing enough information to perform the review of analysis, but we still need to verify, is this true in the real world, right? So the first step, we check the log of transactions to verify whether we have all the steps, all the transaction operations properly documented. So we check whether every transaction has records for creation, submission, approval, and processing, and we see the timestamps and we see the names of the users, because accountability comes with the documentation, because we can only call someone for accountability if we see the name of this person against particular operation. So the information in this log, this information in the log is vitally important, because if we don't have this information, the rest of the testing program wouldn't make any sense. Right, so step number 2. First, we check whether the processing is done only after the approval, meaning that first goes the approval. First, the checker reviews the transaction, because the risk may materialize when we process transaction and get it out of the door. This is where we let our cash go outside of our scope of control. And if the review is not done before that point, but after, even if we detect any errors, we cannot get our money back. So first we verify whether processing is done only after approvals are placed. And also there could be another scenario, right? Approvals review is done before the processing, but the absence of approval doesn't prevent processing from happening. So that's also important. It's not only about the sequence of the steps, but the presence of approval before the processing phase. And you see in the brackets, you see the evidence expected. We may not always know what kind of evidence exactly we are going to see. Not every time, because we are auditors, and we are not working 24/7 on the processes we audit, unlike our auditees. And so we may not know exactly the form of the evidence, the artifacts available. However, what we must know what kind of information we should look in the evidence. So we expect here to see the log records, and for every step we should finish every step with some evidence, right? So in our case, for the step 2, the evidence will be the timestamps of the approval and processing events, right? So we compare them. We should verify whether the timestamp attribute, right, is greater than approval timestamp attribute, right? As long as the artifacts comply with this rule, we're safe, because in that case we see every time a processing is done after approval. So the step number 3 is about separation of duties. So we're checking whether makers and checkers are different persons, right? So in that case, we can use the log, still can use the log. So you see that's how fruitful this artifact is. And in that case, we can verify whether the names are different. Important, sometimes some systems, some applications, they may allow users to be both makers and checkers, meaning they could act in both roles, but the system does not allow the users to approve their own transactions. So the only thing we can check here that the persons are different. And number 4, so here's a bit challenging step, because we'd like to verify whether checkers perform the review diligently, right? So in this case, we need to do the checker's work. It's a bit of going outside of the log scope, because we need additional documentation to be obtained. So in that case, we need to take the original requirements for the transaction. It could be, for instance, the payment instruction or contract, and verify whether a sample of the transactions match the underlying documentation. If we find any errors, it may be signal that the checkers is not always doing their work well. Sometimes it might be just small errors which may not necessarily affect the transaction processing. However, sometimes that might be critical, but we'll check it in the few slides after. Right. Oh, number five. Well, we also may test who is approving and who is checking, unless this particular role distribution is not covered in access control testing. So the particular test steps will depend on your full audit program and your full OAT for across all the controls. Sometimes it might be more practical to verify user access in the access control testing OAT. All right. Now, what to test, right? That's the question, because imagine we are reviewing 12 months of control execution, and we have 5,000 transactions. Well, putting aside automation, right, where it's possible, because sometimes the controls may not be that straightforward as one in the example. Sometimes control may require additional context knowledge, additional product knowledge, something which is not easy to automate, or probably it could be automated, but it might not be cost benefit effective, right? So Now, if we need to test this manually or with some tools of automation, but generally we need to go over each item with our own eyes. So in that case, we need to reduce the scope of the testing, because again, we cannot test 5,000 transactions. It's just impossible, right? However, the audit is based on the idea that a fraction of the whole population of the transactions may represent to some degree the whole population, right? It's not like it couldn't reflect 100%, right? We cannot say that we tested, I don't know, 30% of the population and we can assure you that the rest of the population is fine. No, there's always a percentage of the error. Internal audit never gives 100% assurance, right? We give reasonable assurance. That's why we're testing samples. So first we make a sample. However, the sample should be retrieved from the population, and that's in that case, before going into the sampling, we need to understand what is our population. Once we get the population, we get the sample, we identify the artifacts and collect the artifacts we need, and we run the test. So the population, the most important thing, because the well-defined population may save a lot of time and may prevent us from wasting time on doing the work which will not give us any value. And what is the population? Population are our cases, control cases within the period where we can expect the control to be executed. For example, all processed transactions for the period 24 from November 24 to October 25. Or speaking about technology audits, IT incidents for the whole year 2025. So now we understand generally what we need to test. However, the next important step, very important, is reduction of the population. Why it's important and why we should do it all the time. First of all, population reduction doesn't mean we're trying to do less work. It's about focusing on high-risk items. Because look, every sampled item will require equal time for the test, right? However, not every sampled item represents the case of high risk, meaning that we may build up our conclusion on a mix of high and low risk cases, which doesn't comply with the principle of focusing on the most important areas. So that's why we're trying to exclude low risk items and ensure we are testing something meaningful. Again, it's not about reducing the scope of work. It's about making the work more efficient, making audit procedures to bring more result, more value, contribute more to the quality of our assurance. Therefore, what we do, for instance, for transactions, we may apply particular thresholds for the values, right? So for instance, we're not reviewing transactions smaller than $500, or we focus on high-risk products. So we review transactions only that relate only to particular products. Now, for instance, incidents, technology incidents, we can exclude low severity incidents and focus only on something high, right? Systems and processes, instead of looking across all the incidents, right, all the population, we can focus on high-risk applications. It's more important because, I mean, like, if we even find something in low-risk applications, low severity, I mean, there would be much of risk involved. So the risk mitigation of which we're trying to verify won't create significant exposures. It won't make a significant impact to the firm, but at the same time, spending our time and resources on testing low-risk cases, we may miss something high, right? Okay, now examples of the reduction. So before that, in the previous slide, we had examples of the populations, just raw populations, vanilla population. Now you see those populations, but with some additional conditions introduced. So For instance, instead of looking through across all the transactions, we may look to the revolver loan transactions, each of which is more than $500. $500,000 for the period from November 1st to October 31st, 24 to 25, right? Now, security all IT incidents of severity 1 and 2 for critical and high critical applications, year 2025. So it may significantly reduce our population, probably from, I don't know, from 5,000 transactions, maybe to 500, or like 1,000. It's maybe up to 80%. But in the same time, that's very strange, but in the same time, reducing the amount of work, we significantly increase effectiveness of our work because we do not focus on low risk items. Right. Now, sampling. It's not enough to just reduce the population. It's still too large to test. It could still be large to test even after we reduced it. So now we need to think how many items from the population we want to take to run the test on those items, and then say we tested those items, and on the basis of that we can conclude for the rest of the population, right? So what is sample? The sample is a selected subset of the population items, right? And the results of their testing will represent the population. Now, so meaning like if we say we sampled, I don't know, 60 out of 1,000 transactions, right? And we say the control for the whole 1,000 transactions has the same effectiveness as this for this population. Now we have two types of sampling, statistical and non-statistical sampling. So I was mostly working with non-statistical sampling. Therefore, this is the topic which we will review in details in today's lecture. However, anyway, we'll do some kind of comparison between statistical and non-statistical sampling. Right, so sampling, statistical sampling is done through the usage of a formula. And there are a lot of sampling calculators which will give you understanding how many items you have to sample from the population to give assurance for 90%, for 95%, right? However, for the population which are statistically meaningful, starting probably from 600 up to infinity, right? It might be just too much. It might be too many items to test. For instance, to do statistical sampling for 600 items, roughly with 90% of the confidence, meaning like you reserve just 10% probability that there's some errors in the rest of the population, you might need like 200, maybe 250 items. It's about 40-50%, which is a lot of work to be done, right? It's not always needed, and sometimes you may think about non-statistical sampling, but there is and by the way, there could be the cases where you the statistical sampling might not be efficient. It's when you don't have statistically meaningful population, because you should have at least about 500 or 600 items in the population to make it statistically significant. All right, so now non-statistical sampling. The size of non-statistical sampling is not calculated using formula, but more about your methodology. So I think if you check your internal audit methodology, you will see some guidance on how many items you should sample. The most important thing here is how we define the size of non-statistical sampling. And the size is driven by a few factors, which you see on the screen. So first one is actually complexity of the controls. If the control is straightforward and easy to understand, easy to execute, you probably think about smaller population, or smaller sample, right? If the control is complex to execute, so there is more room for errors, you probably think about high risk associated with the sampling, and you think about it, maybe you need to sample more. Now, the second factor is the judgment. So, is the control fully, for instance, automated and fully protected by the application control capabilities, or there is some judgment element is involved, right? So, it's a living person is taking the decision, go right or go left. Again, what judgment is required, so probably you want to sample more. Now, do we have any history of issues for a specific control, right? So you may have probably the issues last audit 2 years ago. Issues were fixed. However, you think, okay, I probably need I need to sample more to get more assurance on the testing results. And final point is the population size or control frequency. So here's the thing. When sometimes you have periodical controls, right? Cyclical controls. They're executed against the calendar, right? Every year, once a year, annual. Every 6 months, semi-annual, or quarterly controls, right? Monthly, daily, or even multiple times a day. Or there could be controls that are event-driven. So, for instance, the transaction approval, it's not scheduled, right? The approver, the checker, reviews the transaction once it gets to their queue. And in that case, we cannot use the control frequency calendar to build up the the sample size. So in that case, we need to understand how many items within the period reviewed we have, like in the example with 5,000 transactions a year. So how it works. So for instance, here, and in my lecture, I give examples only for high-risk control, high-risk samples. So depending on the answers of those questions, which is went through, you may have kind of a low threshold, for instance, for low-risk cases when control is not too complex, the control is not judgmental, you didn't have any issues in the past, so probably you may set it kind of a low threshold. And for the more risky situations, you can set a high threshold. However, in our case, we're just reviewing the high ceiling. So for instance, you see on the left the cyclical controls: yearly, quarterly, semi-annually, monthly, weekly, daily, and you see the sample size grows with the frequency, right? So we have just one item for yearly. Well, it's normal because that's kind of 12 months is something usual we can find across the audit periods. And of course, it's 1 year and we may not expect to see more than one control execution, right? Well, that's life. We can conclude on the control effectiveness using just one item. And of course, in the situations like that, we cannot use statistical sampling. Now, quarterly or semi-annually. Well, semi-annually might be 1 or 2. Quarterly should be 2. Just, like 1 for quarter, it's not enough because it's done 4 times. We cannot use the same sampling as for yearly. So 2 for quarterly controls is fine. Or, it's always up to you, because audit is something where third line gives assurance, and this assurance should be signed. And it's more about the personal confidence, personal view of an auditor. Ask yourself, would I put my signature on the statement that control works well based on, for instance, a sample of 2, or maybe you would like to sample all 4 quarters. Let's say it's kind of the minimal sample size, right? So 2. Maybe if you want to sample more, you should go and sample more. Now, monthly, 12 executions, 4 items, which is reasonable. 10 out of 52 weeks, or if we're speaking about daily, we should sample 30. If it's more than once a day, meaning even if it's 3 times a day, right, it gives more than 1,000 executions every year, right? So in that case, we may want to sample even more, like 50, 60. So those are periodical controls with cyclical frequency. Now, on the right, we have so-called ad hoc controls or event-driven controls. And again, we're talking about the same period, same 12 months, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be kind of a whole year, because you can start your audit in May, right? In that case, you can sample something from May current year to June, sorry, to April previous year. I'm sorry, June. Right, so see, and this is kind of, if we see that there were up to 5 executions, control executions within this period from June last year to May this year, in case we can sample all of them, or at least a couple, right? So if we see up to 50, it means we need to make a sample of 5, right? If we see that the population grows up to 250, maybe we want to sample 10 and more. 500 will require us to test 30, and more than 500, it's 60 or more. And here's the thing, it's not kind of the figure is carved in stone, right? It's something that you could see in industry. Some companies may ask for smaller samples. Some companies may ask for the high sample sizes. It depends on the methodology, it depends on the audit risk appetite, it depends on general practices and maturity of the processes, because some processes might be mature. They may work very stable for and demonstrate sustainability over years, sometimes decades, right? In that case, it might not be practical to test too much. Sometimes you may operate in the changing environment, especially nowadays when the new technologies are being, like AI, machine learning, may be implemented pretty much across everywhere. And when you deal with the situations like that, when there is no history of the sustainable control execution, you may think about increasing the sample sizes. Okay. Now, applying the sample. So it's very straightforward and simple for cyclical controls. You don't need to take any system extracts. You don't need to take any reports, because the only thing you need is calendar. So if you have, for instance, monthly controls, right? You don't ask from the log, you ask from calendar, because you know that control is expected to be executed every month, right? And if it's not executed, in that case, it means control failure. So you just need to ask evidence for specific months. So you just make a list of the months, so for instance, from March to February, right? And just pick specific lines, sample specific lines where you want to see the controls. You may apply them randomly, you may apply some knowledge for the month selections, but you should end up with at least 4 months. And for those 4 months, you should request the evidence. However, if you're dealing with ad hoc controls, it might not be that straightforward. First, you need to understand how many items you have, right? And if you're dealing with large volumes of information, right, and technology, for instance, when it's speaking about cloud environment, it might be even millions of records. And that's a lot of information. You cannot just quickly extract that. First, you need to check what is the size of the population, first of all. Right, so for this one, you may ask your auditees, or if self-source it if you have access, just to get the limited extract. Limited means the number of columns should be limited. For instance, instead of extracting the whole report, which might be too large, because sometimes it might be hundreds of columns in the tables or in the consolidated report, getting information from different tables. Instead of that, you need just to understand what are the items, how many items you have, right? You can just, for instance, on this example on the left, in limited columns, you have just 3 columns from the original database: a transaction ID, creation date, and its value. This is what you need to understand your population, right? And you see, this is an example just of 3 lines, but there is like totally, let's say, 400 records. And when you get this report, this limited columns report, you can just mark by particular items you want to sample, and that's going to be your sample for which you're getting the full extract, right? Full report with hundreds of, well, in this case, about 20 columns, right? Where you extract only those records which you sampled. So in that case, it might be more practical to go that way, just to save time. Sometimes you may end up, if you make a full extract of data, you may end up with gigabytes of information, and you will have problems with working with it, even like Excel or different tools of data analytics. It might be just challenging. It's better to just work with the limited extracts. All right, so now we get our sample, and now we need to apply our testing program to it. You remember those 4 steps which we had in the beginning. Now we're applying those steps to our sample. First, we need to verify whether our transaction log contains all necessary data attributes, right? So we need to see whether we have records. Every record has the stamps of creation, submission, approval, and processing. We see the timestamps, and we see usernames perform the action. Now, as example, we have the creation date. We have the name of the user who created the transaction. We see when it was submitted and who submitted that and who approved that and when it was processed. So all fields are present. Now, next step, the transaction, the processing is done after the approval. We verify whether the timestamp of processing transaction is after the approval timestamp. You see here, for instance, the approval was placed on 12th of March 25 at 15:03. 48. But processed was done almost immediately, but 3 seconds after. It means that first approval was placed, right? So this test is fine. We can mark it OK. Now, we need to check whether makers and checkers are different persons, right? So we see that the was created and submitted by Mr. Smith. The approval was placed by Miss Reina, and it means that the step is also successful. We put OK here. Now, but the last step is more complicated because we need to reconcile the transaction details against the original underlying documentation. So for instance, here we have an example with a payment instruction, right? All those examples, they're absolutely fictional, right? So it's the information created specifically for that particular lecture. And you see here the black box. This is a fictional customer payment instruction, and we match it back to the transaction details. So we see that the company name, does it match or not? Now amount and the currency and the beneficiary and beneficiary account and the transaction reference, would they match or not? So by the way, payment reference will give us understanding how to properly match the underlying documentation and the transaction log and all this information as well. So here we're trying to apply our knowledge and to imitate the step of the review, right? We need to end up with the same review result as we see in the transaction log. So for instance, if we see that something doesn't match, it should be rejected, right? The transaction should be rejected. Now, if all those checks pass, in that case, we apply them to every transaction from our sample, every item of 25. And we end up with the testing documentation, which may look something like that. testing documentation is very important. The design part is also standardized, right? We have templates for design assessment, we have templates for operating effectiveness testing, but OET is more algorithmical, is more systemic, and it has more data comparing to the design effectiveness assessment. And that's very important to document it in a straightforward way, which can be easily understood. Why? Because the standards of quality of documentation for internal audit say that the quality should be sufficient for a cold reviewer to take the audit file, review the evidence, and come to the same conclusion as the auditor. So therefore, it's very nice to keep your OET documentation, well, any documentation, especially OET, in order, and have tables or reports on the testing results. So as you may see, all the sample transactions we have here, they are listed on the left. Every row represents one transaction tested. And each column here, starting from the second one, it represents the testing steps. So first we run whether all transactions have all required data attributes, then whether the processing was done after approval, whether the different persons approved transaction, and whether review was done properly. Now we also add some more columns here on the right, and by the way, you may add even more if you need to store additional information. So that's exceptions. Did we find anything which is not okay, right? Should describe it here. Now, reference to the evidence, because we don't necessarily need to put all the evidence to this file. Let's say it's Excel file, for instance, right? If you document an Excel file or you document it in your audit system, audit management system, in that case, you probably need to refer to the evidence, underlying evidence. So in that case, we have A081, it's our transaction log. But for instance, for the fails, you may need to get additional context of the problem, request additional evidence, additional artifacts from auditees. And in that case, if you use them, if they are relevant, you also need to leave references to those artifacts here on testing results. And final conclusion. Not every exception will lead to the failure of controls. Because remember, it's not about have not checklist. Audit work is about assessing whether there was significant unmitigated amount of risk that may expose the organization to unnecessary losses. Well, all losses are unnecessary. Right. And final conclusion, whether it failed or not. Again, so you may sample 25, 40 items, and if you have minor problems and even some of the steps fail, that doesn't mean that control overall isn't effective. So that was the attribute testing and its documentation. Now, moving on, observation. Observation approach, observation audit procedure is different from attribute testing because here we're checking how the control is working in action. It could be processes, could be observation how people do their job, it's observation how application is working. And here are some pros and cons for this approach. And so as you may see, pros is very good because it's real-time evidence. You see how the systems, the processes, the people work. Sometimes it's easier to see, to have a demo rather than have hours of explanation, right? Process understanding. The real-time execution gives you the full picture because every time someone is telling you the story, it's still just a part of the real process, right? When you see the real process, you may see the things that may not be explained directly or may be omitted non-deliberately. So the process understanding is really good. It's a very nice advantage of the observation. And it's very good for walkthroughs, right? Because every time you start audit, you have the session of walkthroughs because you want to understand how the process and systems in your scope work, right? And the live demonstration, live observation, it's very useful. You can quickly grasp the main ideas, the main principles, and see the what's important and what may not be as important. However, there are some cons to it. First, you just see what's going on right now. So the observation will not tell you what was in the past. It's time consuming because, well, comparing to like the discussions, right, it might be better, but it's still sometimes you just need to wait and see. Sometimes just might take half a day for you to see, to get understanding. And if you need to if you realize that you probably haven't asked for something to show you some specific operations, some specific step, right, you may need to run it again. And of course, if something is not shown, you will not notice that. If some of the risk scenarios missed or probably never happened, in that case, how can you see this unless you are testing an application behavior? So I will tell you about the observations on an example of automated controls testing. You would ask, well, Anton, why do we need to observe the automation? Something is automated, right? And it means we don't need to observe it. Well, even when you see the production log of something, right, when you see some automated control, you may see only results, but you don't know what's behind those results. And in some cases, you may just not have control failures in production. I mean, when control identify an exception. And just to make sure that the system works as it was, capabilities that work as discussed with your auditees, you have two options. You may review the code, or you may just review the system in action in different control scenarios. And I would say the second is preferable because code reviews are difficult, and there is more room for audit error, right? A mission or something that you can't understand because the code architecture might be very complex, and you may not always possess necessary skills for the code reviews. So sometimes it's just easier to have your control, automated control, to be executed in lower environment. Of course, it's always non-production environment, and just see how it works, just to show different scenarios, including failures, because it's absolutely safe to do this in non-production environments. Right, so, and here we have some examples of those controls. It could be data validations, reconciliations, right? For example, system A receives data from the system B and apply validation rules just to make sure that the data we ingest from the system B, right, is correct data, that we will not ingest something and record into system A database something which is not good, which will impact the quality of data on the system A side. So when the validation rule fails, in that case system A stops the process, the data is not ingested because the controls perform it always, it must be performed before the data gets ingested, right? So the data ingestion starts only after all the rules are checked, and if we identify any failures, in the case we stop data acquisition and we reject the payload and we send an email notification to the support team, and probably system A raises an instant ticket. Right, so, and what we're going to do with this? Of course, we will review the past validation log, we will do attribute testing. Oh, by the way, I just realized that I missed to describe one item, which is the sample size for automated controls. You might be surprised, but the sample size is just one. We have 2, 5, 10, 30, 60 items for the ad hoc controls executions, but when we talk about automation, we sample just one. Why is that? The answer is very simple. We don't need to test more than one, just because the applications, the technology solutions, they're quite deterministic. So when you pass specific input, you always get the same output, right? And the same with the code. So you mean like you're So if your code works, it's going to, with particular result, it's going to give the same result every time you run it. Therefore, you don't need to test more than one sample. However, that's very important, and that's very, very important. It doesn't mean you just need to run one test. It doesn't mean you can just sample a single item from the log, right? The point is that you need to test one example for every control scenario. So, for instance, if you have data validation control, it is expected that you would test the successful data ingestion execution, right? The failure ingestion execution, and if you have multiple rules, you may probably need to make a sample of those rules to be failed, or probably if you get a report on every failed rule, probably you need to fail all of them. Also, you need to check whether probably not only the data validation rules may fail, but whether the system is checking whether the payload we receive it's actually in the correct format. It could be, maybe it might be damaged during the transmission, and the validation control wouldn't be able to process it just because the structure is impaired, right? What's going to happen in that case? Will the system reject it? Will the system crash? Will the system ingest the payload? So that could be, at least here we have at least 3 different scenarios, each of which should be tested on a sample of 1. So if you have more scenarios, right, you should test sample of 1 for every scenario. So you have everything to be covered with the scenarios, right? So in that case, right, so we have kind of positive and negative testing. So positive testing means it's successful pass. So for the validation, it means that all the validation rules passed the check and we ingested the information. Negative testing means we want to verify that the system is able to capture the bad data, right? And in that case, we are asking our auditors to prepare the testing data sets, or probably if feasible, we can provide the testing data sets to the auditors. Depends on the complexity of the data sets, data model. And we ask, maybe through the screen sharing session, we ask the support team to demonstrate how the system works. So, and every step in the program should be documented with at least one artifact, right? So in our case, we need to see the data set to be fed. It should be a screenshot or an extract. We need to see the how testing data is being fed, right? So we send the data, we submit data to the system. We want to see the application log that has a record, so the data was sent. We want to see the errors that were captured. So because, for instance, we asked our stakeholders to prepare a data set which for the transaction payload, data payload, which doesn't have transaction ID, and we want to see how the system will capture the transaction ID, missed transaction ID attribute. And in the step number 3, we want to see that transaction ID was missed. There should be application error in the log. Now we want to verify that the data wasn't ingested. We want to have the screenshot of the database or extract from the database showing 0 records when we're trying to search for the testing data set. And we want to see that an email was sent or incident ticket was raised after the issue was detected by the system A. And of course, the last very important point, so when we're working in a non-production environment, there is always the possibility that the version we're testing doesn't match the version in production, right? And it's absolutely normal because sometimes, well, frequently tests are being done in UAT environment, and UAT environment, it's always one step ahead of production, because if you're, especially for the systems under development, right, UAT always has the next version that are being tested by users. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your lower environment version wouldn't be relevant, because the difference might not relate to the capabilities you're testing. Normally it doesn't. And in that case, you need the evidence of the particular releases in production environment and the test environment and the delta of the user stories or whatever documented changes between those 2 versions. Normally, this information can be extracted from some DevOps tools. Okay, that was observation, and you document those observations normally in the form of screenshots, in Microsoft Word file, which you can just save as evidence. Now, moving on, Reperformance, the last item, Reperformance. So it differs from attribute testing, it differs from the observation, because we're trying to reproduce the results of the control supply and the control logic. Normally it's done for the reports. And here's some pros for this approach. So first, it's independent execution, right? We take the raw data, original data, we take the production, live report, we take the control design, and we just apply it on fully 100% on audit side. And once we finish, we see the results. We can compare the result which was produced by business with the result, with the outcome after our reperformance. If there are any discrepancies, in that case we can question them. Now it's direct evidence. We get production data, we get business data, we apply business control, and there is no room for misunderstanding or misinterpretation, right? For complex control, it's very good because it's similar to observation, right? Instead of taking a deep dive into the complexities of the controls, you can just do the recalculation, especially when you have means of automation. Even Excel would be sufficient with formulas, especially with macros, right? So, and you get result immediately without spending time to understand the underlying and assess underlying control logic. And of course, it can detect hidden errors. For instance, you may not necessarily have all the potential issues in the production data, right, in business data, but you can play with the particular input with the raw data and see if specific errors are detected. And also, you never ensured from the point that they sometimes just two systems may not work perfectly all the time, and sometimes some reports may require additional verification and probably manual data input to get to the final result, right? And it will not be visible if you review just the final artifacts of the process. However, it's very time consuming. Of course, when you're reviewing something year after year, and that you have tools of automation, it makes it easier, but still it's time consuming. And again, getting back to the hidden errors may not reflect real behavior, but it allows to detect the mismatches, the delta between real behavior and what was actually the story that you've been told. Okay, so what do we do? Normally we do cover the cases, things like reporting, like recalculations, in our case taxes, interest rates, reconciliations, especially in accounting, right? It's very good for the Reperformance. Data transformation controls, especially for the data quality management, it's very nice because the data transformation tools, they have the specific rules, specific steps in the data transformation which are easy to reproduce, right? But again, it's very important, as always, all critical scenarios should be covered, right? It's not sufficient just to reperform it for the successful path, right? You need to think about what could go wrong, right? And how you can capture if something goes wrong, right? Or went wrong. But there are some drawbacks, like complex testing logic, and if you do the work manually, right? So, and if you find some discrepancies, it doesn't mean there is an issue, just because that might be an error during the reperformance. In that case, if you go to stakeholders and they explain the problem, you find this error, right? You need to go back and reperform it again, which might be annoying. And of course, if you're using CATs, you're not liable to that type of errors, but you need to extensively test the CATs before you bring them to the real audit. You should make sure that your CATs works ideally without any errors. So that's it about operating effectiveness testing. So I decided not to cover the handling of exceptions and issues in this chapter on this lecture, because it's still a lot of information to digest, and this is something we are going to cover in our next lesson, which is called exceptions and issues. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this lecture was useful, and the information which I shared, you can use it in your audits, in your reviews, in your controls, and you may, if you're not auditor, you will better understand what auditors need to make it communications better, more productive, more efficient. And thank you, and see you in the next video.